the faint glow of dying candlelight, Sister Agnes sat in stillness, her hands clenched tightly in prayer, her white habit soaked in blood. Deep, dark stains spread across the once pure fabric. Pooling beneath her on the cold, ancient stone, the steady drip of blood formed an eerie rhythm, like a clock ticking toward an inevitable end. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixated on the large crucifix hanging at the front of the chapel, but her gaze seemed to pierce beyond it, into a void that no one else could see. Hours ago, the other nuns had fled in terror, their frantic footsteps echoing through the hollow halls. They had not dared to look back, nor question what horrors had unfolded, but Sister Agnes remained, locked in place, her lips moving silently, muttering prayers too faint, too foreign to understand. Father Thomas, the aging priest, had been summoned in the dead of night. He arrived just after midnight, pale and trembling, clutching his rosary so tightly the beads left marks on his palm. His faith had been steadfast for years, yet what awaited him inside the chapel that night threatened to shatter it. The scene was like something from a nightmare. The blood, it wasn't hers. Not a single mark marred her pale skin. And yet the blood drenched her. It clung to her habit, her face, her hands, as though it had chosen her. It dripped endlessly from her fingertips, staining the sacred floor beneath her. Sister Agnes, Father Thomas's voice wavered, the sound barely escaping his lips. The echo of his words seemed to hang in the air. Unanswered, she gave no sign of hearing him. Her lips continued their silent chant, though no words could be heard. With each step closer, the chill in the chapel deepened. The air grew dense, pressing down on his chest like a great weight. His breaths became shallow, the cold gnawing at him as though the very atmosphere itself had turned hostile.
"Sister Agnes," he called again, his voice rising slightly in desperation. His hand trembled as he raised his crucifix toward her. "What is this?"
Her lips fell still, but she did not meet his gaze. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on the crucifix above the altar. Father Thomas followed her gaze and recoiled in horror. The crucifix, the very symbol of their faith, was beginning to twist, the edges of the wood bent and warped, writhing as if possessed by something unseen. The crown of thorns tightened around Christ's head, and the serene wooden face contorted into an expression of unbearable torment. The priest stumbled back, crossing himself as a cold sweat broke out across his brow. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," he stammered, but the words died in his throat. The temperature in the chapel dropped further still, and a darkness began to creep in from the corners of the room, swallowing the weak flickers of candlelight. The blood at Sister Agnes's feet stirred, flowing unnaturally, as though it had a will of its own. It spread across the floor in twisting, unnatural patterns, forming symbols that pulsed with a sickening red glow. Then came the whispers. Low, malevolent murmurs filled the room, carried on a wind that should not exist. Father Thomas could hear them clearly now, though the words were in a language older than memory itself. From the shadows, something moved, something watching. Shaking, Father Thomas lifted his crucifix again. "By the power of Christ, I command," before he could finish. Sister Agnes rose, slowly, impossibly she stood. Her body moved with unnatural grace, her blood-soaked gown swaying as if caught in a phantom breeze. Her face turned toward him, her eyes empty, dark pits that swallowed all light. Her mouth, once silently praying, now twisted into a cold, malicious smile. "Salvation," she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast, hollow chapel. "You seek salvation, Father, but something else has come." With a deafening crash, the chapel doors slammed shut. Father Thomas spun toward them, rushing to escape, but the heavy wooden doors would not budge. His frantic banging was met only by the rising whispers, now growing louder, more insistent. The glowing symbols on the floor pulsed in time with the voices, casting grotesque, flickering shadows that danced across the walls.
Sister Agnes stepped toward the altar, her bare feet leaving bloody prints behind. "They called," she murmured, her voice disturbingly calm, and I answered.
Father Thomas turned, his breath hitching in his chest as he watched the crucifix above the altar crack. Splinters of wood fell to the ground as Christ's figure crumbled, piece by piece, from the gathering darkness. Something vast and unspeakable began to emerge. Its form too horrifying to comprehend, it filled the chapel with a suffocating dread, its presence oppressive, ancient, and evil. The priest fell to his knees, clutching his rosary as he muttered desperate prayers, but deep within, he knew no one was listening. Sister Agnes stood before the altar, her eyes gleaming with the dark power that now coursed through her. As the whispers reached their fevered pitch, she turned once more to Father Thomas, her smile growing wider, colder. It has begun. That night, there were no screams, no final, desperate pleas for mercy, only a cold, chilling laugh that echoed through the darkened halls of the convent, long after the last candle had flickered out.